morning as I share, as Pastor Rick said, about our family's direction towards gospel missions in Iceland. So to start out, because most people don't have much of a context for Iceland as a nation, I'll tell you a little bit about it as a country. So it sits right on the Arctic Circle in the North Atlantic Sea. It's kind of just floating out there all by itself. There's not much going on around it. And to give you kind of a frame of reference, so geographically it's almost identical in size to the state of Kentucky. So that kind of gives you a good frame of reference. However, the population is around 370,000 people. So I'm from Metro Detroit, so it is 1/6 the size of the county that I live in. So very sparsely populated. The reason for that is, as you can see, all of the towns are along the coast. There's nothing in the middle that's inhabitable land. It's all unusable as far as industry and living there. So everyone that lives there is in a coastal city. So Reykjavik down there in the southwest, that is the capital of the nation, as well as where about 70% of the population live. So strategically, that is where we are going to be living. It just makes the most sense. That's where all the people are. So about 370,000 people, as I said. And Reykjavik has about 233,000 people. This is, as I said, this is our targeted area as far as ministry and outreach. So if you're familiar at all with the other Nordic nations, it very much fits into that whole scheme of things. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, very similar as far as culture goes. Iceland, it is known as a land of extremes. There's a reason why, if you go on Instagram or you look at different photos, like the people go there to explore, right? It's a hiker's paradise. It has pretty much everything that you could want, geographically speaking, from black sand beaches to highlands to volcanoes to glaciers. It's really got it all. What really emphasizes the extremity of Iceland, of course, if you're familiar with Alaska as well, those far north places where people live, is in the midsummer they have the midnight sun, which means they have 24 hours of sunlight for about a month. The sun never sets, which poses all sort of joys, but also difficulties, especially with young children trying to get their sleep schedule situated. And then, of course, the flip side of it, in the winter, they get about 3 hours of sunlight. So we were just there for the whole month of January. And when we arrived, which was on January 2nd, the sun rose at 11:30 and set at 2. So we experienced very much what that is like in the dead of winter. So Iceland, the Icelanders have been living in survival mode really since the beginning. There are so many different ways that this nation and this island can kill you that they have done everything they can just to make sure that they are able to survive as a culture and as a people group.
And you want to go there.
And what?
And you want to go
That's right, yes. By the grace of God, yes. So just as an example of this, the Icelandic language contains 156 different words for wind. As in, like, different kinds of wind. And if you don't believe me, here they are. Here's all 156 different words. Don't ask me to even try, because I'm not gonna. So,
It'll take a year to figure out all those men.
That's right. So when we look at Iceland really as a nation and as a people group, how do we understand their worldview as far as people that have lived in this context? So essentially, at this point in history, they could be classified basically as non-religious. So most Icelanders, I'll talk about this in just a moment, there is a state church that is present there, but most Icelanders are not engaged at all in Christianity of any form, so non-religious is really what they would mostly identify as. There's also a resurgence of what's called neo-paganism. So if you know anything about the Vikings, of course they're very popular right now. People just love to learn about the Vikings and watch movies and things like that. That paganism that was reflected in the original culture of the Vikings who settled Iceland, that really is gaining more ground as people are going back to that. So the fundamental belief of the Icelanders is really the sacredness of nature. So most of them would not specifically call themselves atheists because they do believe in some form of higher power, and that higher power is nature. Right? The spirituality, the sacredness of nature and our responsibility to respect and protect it. Because of how much the climate and the nature around them impacts their day-to-day lives. This really is at the core of their belief system. So the Icelanders, they are extremely self-sufficient. Again, because they've managed to live on this hunk of volcanic rock for 1,000 years, they have a great sense of nationalistic pride. They're very rugged, right? They're very people of the earth, very much about digging in and embracing that. But they're also very laid back. So if you're familiar with most island cultures, they don't operate on, like we do, they don't operate on a time-based culture. It's very much a relationship-based culture. So they really throw calendars away. They don't really work on a strict schedule, but it's very much about we go with the flow, and you have to be very flexible. So those are just different characteristics of the Icelanders. So their worldview has been defined as what's called optimistic naturalism. Optimistic in the sense that they believe that since they've managed to survive for as long as they have on this island, they're going to continue to be able to do so as a people group. And of course it's natural because it's so much embraced and engaged in the world around them as far as nature goes. So the worldview has actually been officially summarized and defined. There was a national survey a couple of years ago, and they asked the Icelanders, what phrase would you use to describe your belief system? And it basically came out to Þetta Reddest, which loosely translates as everything will work out in the end. Or you might know it as Hakuna Matata, right? Everything will work out in the end. And if you ask them why, like why will everything work out in the end? Of course, we as believers understand that we have a sovereign God who is in control of all things, and he promises, right, that all things work together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. But when you remove all sort of biblical spirituality, Christianity out of that equation, the why to that question is, and the answer to that is because it always has. We've always managed to make it through, and so we always will be able to make it through in the end. When you look at this optimistic frame of reference, there's different, of course, statistics now that come out of this. The first of which is somehow, I don't know who measures like world happiness, but someone has put together a mathematical equation every year to come out with a world happiness index. Iceland, as well as you can see, most of the Nordic nations all come in within the top 10. Almost every year. Iceland is almost always at the top of that as well. So in 2021, it was number 3 on the World Happiness Index. Iceland is almost always number 1 on the Global Peace Index. So this would be taking into equation crime rate, quality of life, all these different sorts of things. And Iceland is considered to be the most peaceful nation on the planet as well. Partly because who on earth wants to invade Iceland? Like what? You're not going to gain anything from doing that. So very peaceful as far as a people group. They also are recognized all throughout media as having some of the highest gender equality between men and women in the workplace. Sometimes it's referred to as one of the best places in the world for women to live and to work because they have such equality between men and women. So you would think, right, these are 3 things that everyone strives after in the modern world: happiness, peace, and equality. You think, okay, they've got it all together, and yet Iceland also always comes in at number 1 in the world of the highest consumer of antidepressants. How you square those, happiness and depression, like I don't know how you tie those 2 together. But as we've looked at this really demonstrates that there's something clearly missing, that there's a hole within their worldview that needs to be filled with something. So to give you a little bit of a background of Iceland as a religious landscape, so it was settled as I mentioned, by the Vikings. Norse heathenry, so this is worship of Thor, Odin, Loki. Marvel has popularized all of these now, but these were very much actual deities that people worshipped not that long ago. And so it was settled right around the year 864, and pretty quickly after that, about 150 years later, the king of Norway at the time, he converted to Catholicism. And so he set his missionary sites on Iceland, and he sent his missionaries and the priests there, and Iceland en masse converted to Catholicism because it was between convert or we are going to kill you. And so en masse, the Icelanders converted to Catholicism. Fast forward 500 years as the Reformation is sweeping all throughout Europe, and the Lutherans now come to the shore of Iceland, as at this point in time the King of Denmark, who at this point occupied and pretty much reigned over Iceland, he sent his Lutheran missionaries over, and once again it was either convert or we are going to kill you. And so en masse the Icelanders converted from Catholicism to Lutheranism.
Is that gonna be your strategy?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. At this point, in 1550, en masse, they converted to Lutheranism, and to this day, Iceland and most of the Scandinavian countries have had an official state-sponsored religious body. So in Iceland, it's called the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Iceland, which about 63% of the population are still registered members of this church. Now, most people, when they see this, and we've had this experience with some churches, different sending agencies, different people, when you see this number, you're like, okay, they don't need the gospel, they don't need missionaries, they have it, right? They have a state-sponsored church, they have, 63% of people apparently are registered members of the church. However, when you look at this church and this denomination as a whole, it has strayed so far away from the gospel. And you can see this because there are church buildings in literally every community in Iceland. And they're beautiful, they're little historic church buildings, but almost none of them are actually used for anything anymore. We went and visited a couple, and they'll have a plaque that says, established in such and such a time, but there's no services, there's nothing, actually no congregation or anything. They're basically just historical monuments to an era that is gone, right? That's bypassed. So the state church as a whole has completely embraced the secular revolution, the sexual revolution, all of those things. Seen clearly in the fact that in 2020, the Children's Easter program featured prominently a transgender Jesus. This was broadcast all throughout the country, and it really tells you everything you need to know about how far this church has gone. Another thing that Iceland unfortunately is well known for is a couple years ago there was a big news report that said that Iceland had eradicated Down syndrome from their population. Of course, you know exactly how people eradicate Down syndrome, is by eradicating people with Down syndrome. So Iceland has pretty much 100% rate of after fetal screening, if there's any indication of even the possibility of a genetic abnormality, it's almost 100% an abortion immediately. Of course, our world looks at that and celebrates it as like we've managed to, eradicate all of these things, but really it's just murdering image bearers of God. So a few years ago, so this is Gunnar Gunnarsson. He is the pastor of the church that we will be working with and joining when we get there. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a little bit. But 2 of his 4 children have genetic abnormalities and have, very special needs. And so when his first son was born with a disease that he's one of only 6 people in the world that have this condition. So very much the doctors just assumed this is going to be another abortion, and he's not going to go through with this. But he and his wife caused quite a bit of controversy when he said, we're absolutely not going to kill our child, right? We're going to raise him and protect him, and we want to go through with this pregnancy. This church as a whole, that I'll tell you more about, has been very much on the front lines of protecting the sanctity of life within a culture that sees that as so backwards thinking. Really, when we look at the state church as a whole, there was a professor at one of the universities there, a professor of political science. I thought he summed it up very well. These are not from the words of a believer, right? This is someone who really rejects any notion of Christianity. But he said, you can make the case that a mild national church in a relatively benign form stems off the need for more radical forces. Radical religious groups, which by the way, that would be like us, right? Conservative Christians, that would be considered a radical religious group, have more difficulty here because the national church accommodates to the culture and poses no threat to our way of life. It's like, well, thank you for just laying your cards out on the table. Like, that's a good perspective. When you look at a church that has just basically kowtowed to the culture and said, we will follow your lead when it comes to beliefs and practice and things like that. So all of this has led to the point where now, there's, as I mentioned, there's very little actual embracing of anything religious as far as that goes. So in a recent national survey just a few years ago, they polled a lot of the population, and of those that were polled who were aged 30 years and younger, not a single person on this survey claimed to have any belief in a creator God as we would understand it. So like a divine force out there that is personal and that we can know through creation. So very much, a lack there of any sort of belief. So atheism has been on the rise, but as I mentioned, this isn't so much like hardened atheism as we might know it. This is very much the non-religious type of rejection of Christianity. This is the I really don't care about what you're asking me. You might hear it, we might hear it in our culture as I'm spiritual but not religious, right? You might hear that these days. So that has been very much on the rise. And then as I mentioned, the other thing that is gaining a lot of popularity in Iceland right now is what's called Ásatrú, which is the Norse paganism that the Vikings first brought with them when they settled the nation of Iceland 1,200 years ago. So this is gaining in popularity. This is actually spreading all throughout the world, especially in Western Europe and now into the States. And it actually started in the nation of Iceland and has since spread out from there. So this is actually the fastest growing religion in Iceland, and people are moving to Iceland specifically to join this specific group and going back to the religion of the Vikings. The Hilmar Hilmarsson, and he is what's called the chief Goli, so think of this like the chief priest. He's the head of this religion, and just last week he was in an interview and he said people that are born into a culturally Christian setting like Iceland recognize that Christianity is far past its prime. Unlike dead religion, the Ásatrú is about connecting with the world around you, and people are captivated by a spirituality that actually impacts how you view the life you are living. Our gatherings are not typically what people expect when they think of paganism. I'd say about 90% of the people in our fellowship would consider themselves to be good Lutherans. So again, this just paints the picture of like how far the state church has gone and how removed from any semblance of the gospel it is actually present there in Iceland. So if you look at the table back there, you'll see this little guy. And what this is actually the oldest artifact that's ever been dug out of the ground in Iceland. And as archaeologists and scholars look at this little thing, they still don't know whether or not this is supposed to be a depiction of Christ or a depiction of Thor. And, as we look at this little relic from Iceland, it's kind of this idea of, has Christianity ever actually been the prominent faith of the Icelanders, or has that paganism always been underneath the surface? As time has moved on, it's really seemed like this paganism has never actually left, despite the presence of a state church. That really in the 90s, the registration was in the 95% of people in Iceland were registered members. So you would think, again, but there's just this undercurrent of paganism that is really breaking through the surface these days. So what does Iceland need as far as the gospel goes? The first one, of course, is that Iceland needs the pure gospel. So most Icelanders have only ever been exposed to a Christianity that is not true Christianity, right? It's basically civic moral religion that really has no integration into how you live your life throughout the rest of the day. So they've never heard, at least not from the prominent church that is there, they've never heard the true biblical gospel of faith through Christ and through grace. Because of that, if you have a false gospel, that means you have false churches. You have churches that do not actually preach the gospel. So there's only about 3 churches in the entire country that actually preach what we would recognize as the biblical gospel. And all 3 of those churches that we would say that about are in the Reykjavik area. So if you think back at that map, right, all of those other cities that are around the nation, though they're small, right, most of them are small fishing communities. But the next largest community outside of Reykjavik is in the north, and there's 20,000 people there. So those are 20,000 people that don't have access to a single biblical, faithful preaching church. So there's a big push, really, amongst the believers that are there to plant more healthy, established churches in those communities. And of course, because you have false churches and you have a false gospel, the training that the clergy in the state church go through, as you can imagine, is just devoid of anything relevant to Scripture or to the gospel. So the University of Iceland is where the clergy are trained in their department of religion. And one of the pastors of the church that we will be joining, he went and sat in on their introduction to religion class. And the first thing that the professor said, standing up in front of the class, was, if you've come to learn anything about Christianity, faith, or the Bible, you've come to the wrong place. Again, thank you for just laying your cards out on the table, but that really demonstrates how great of a need there is for biblical training and theological education. So all of those, of course, lead to false conversions, right? So Iceland needs the true gospel, which leads to true, faithful conversion following Christ. So Iceland is post-Christian. That's the term that's used for a lot of Europe nowadays, and it's considered to be the least evangelized nation in the continent of Europe. It's roughly estimated that about 0.03% of the population would consider themselves to be evangelical, which, because of the size, comes out to about 200 people in the entire country that would claim or identify as evangelical believers. And so all of this leads to the fact where Iceland needs help. The church in Iceland, small though it may be, it really needs a lot more help as far as building infrastructure, strengthening the church that's there. But because of its isolation from a lot of the world, and because it has a small population, it's not really on anybody's radar. Most people don't think about Iceland day to day. I do, but that's kind of different because of the context I'm in. But it's not really, no one's thinking about Iceland. No one's thinking about it as a gospel missions opportunity. So they just need a lot of help. So ultimately, the challenge of ministry in Iceland is, how do you present the gospel to a people that really have no perceived need for any level of a savior and really are apathetic to any sort of spiritual conversation? So when you think of missions in different cultures where the religion is the defining mark of the culture, so think highly Muslim contexts, Buddhist contexts, those sort of situations, the challenges there are so difficult because you're dealing with a worldview that in a way understands Christianity and is opposed to it, right? So if you go into a Muslim setting, you're dealing with people that are passionate about their faith and actually care about the questions that you're going to be asking them, right? Who created the world? What is the way of salvation? These are questions that, devout Muslims actually care about the answer to. But when you're dealing with a culture like Iceland, even beginning that conversation, right? You ask the question, who created the world? They're like, I don't even care. Like, it doesn't matter to me. And then that's pretty much the end of the conversation. So, Mark chapter 10, this is the story of the rich young ruler, right, who comes to Christ and says, of course, his first question is flawed. What must I do to inherit eternal life, right? Exposing right there the flaw in his thinking. But we know the story doesn't end well, right? Jesus shows him and points out his hypocrisy and says, go and sell all that you have, because he's powerful, he's wealthy, he's comfortable in his life, and he goes away sad. Right? That's not an end. It's not a good ending to the story as we understand it, because it doesn't seem like his problem has been solved. And this really is what the Icelanders are like. They're comfortable. They have all their needs provided for. They're very educated. All these different things. And so, trying to expose the root of what really needs to be, approached through the gospel there is very, very difficult. So, very broad view of Iceland there. Of course, normally the next question we get asked is, how on earth did Iceland come into your family's lives? To kind of give you a brief overview of how that happened. So it started in the year 2020, as far as Iceland goes. So when my wife and I first met, and when we eventually got married, missions had always been a possibility for us. We both grew up in churches that were very missions-minded. So we didn't know when or where or if. We were always open to it as a family. And so I previously was serving at a church in northern Michigan, and so we were there right after we got married, and then we moved down to a different location, which is where we are now. I accepted a position at another church, and that was January of 2020. So we moved down. 2 months later, of course, the world goes crazy, everything shuts down, and I receive an email saying, we're so sorry, but we can't offer you this position anymore because churches are going to be closed for the foreseeable future. So we're like, okay, now what? We don't know what's going to happen now, and of course, it seems like the world is coming to an end. So at that point in time, that's where I began to work at the factory, which is where I currently am still. And because it was 2020, I decided to read about the Black Plague, because why not? Let's just make myself even more depressed. So the author of this book made this comment in this book about the Black Death, and she said, if I was alive during the first wave of the Black Plague, I would have wanted to have lived in Iceland, because the Black Plague never even made it the first time. Okay, that's cool, nice historical fact. But for some reason, I don't know why, but that just stuck in my brain, and I could not stop thinking about that little factoid. And of course, that led to this question. I was thinking about the Black Death, right? A plague that wiped out 50% of the population of Europe, never even made it to this country. At this point in time, I could not have pointed Iceland out on a map, didn't know a thing about it. My wife didn't know anything about it. But that's what popped this question into my mind, was given how removed and how remote this nation is from the rest of everyone, apparently, has the gospel made it to Iceland, right? Are there churches there? Are there pastors there? What does the status of Iceland as a gospel opportunity look like? So of course, the first thing I do in my generation, the first thing we do is we pull out our smartphone and you Google it. What is the religious status of Iceland? And the first thing I see is that Iceland is 80% Christian. I'm like, okay, that sounds interesting, but I don't believe that. So, of course, doing more digging, and all of these facts that I just shared with you began to come to the surface, and realizing the true spiritual need of Iceland as a community and as a culture. So our sending church is 5 Points Community Church, which is in Auburn Hills, Michigan, which is in the Metro Detroit area. So we are being sent out joyfully from our church family there. Our sending agency is called Reaching and Teaching International Ministries, which is based out of Louisville, Kentucky. So their main focus is the idea that the local church is the ends as well as the means of missions. So what that means is that it is the local church specifically that should be doing the task of missions. They should be training up missionaries and sending them out, and then the goal of missions should be planting and strengthening other healthy local churches all throughout the world. So we are partnering with them. We love them as an agency. There's actually, and we found this out, there is a church planting network currently in Iceland right now that it's not exactly a network yet because there's only one church in this network, but that is the goal, is for the Iceland project to be a network of healthy local churches all throughout the nation. And then, of course, the church that we will be joining and working with there is called Lofstafan Baptistakirke, which is the only Baptist church in the country. And I'm going to move forward and tell you a little bit about this church. So it was started as a home Bible study in 2013. Two families were the two founding families of this church. Gunnar over here, this strapping young Viking lad right here, he is one of the two pastors of the church. He was the founding pastor, and he and his wife basically realized we have nowhere to go as far as a church goes, right? We don't have anywhere we can go that's like-minded and truly believes the Bible. So he posted something on Facebook and said, we're going to start a Bible study in our living room, and if you'd like to join us, we'd love to have you. And this other family, Friedberg and Christine, were the only other family for the first year that came. And so these two families met together for a year, praying together, worshiping, sharing their faith as much as they could. And this then has blossomed now into Lofstafan, which now has a membership of about 40 people. And also it has people from every inhabited continent within the membership, which is just bizarre. And I can tell you more about that in a minute. So it's a tiny, tiny little church, but it's thriving, and it really is a light in a very difficult context. So with 40 members, it is the third largest church in the country as far as community goes. It also sponsors one of their biggest ministries, is they're located right near the University of Iceland, so of course they're engaged in a lot of university ministry to the students. Yes?
So when you say third largest congregation, are you also factoring in the state-sponsored churches?
So, yes, that is factoring that in, but the state church does not, it doesn't practice membership as far as like people showing up. It's if you were baptized as an infant, you are automatically a member. So even though no one's engaged in anything. So when I say third largest, that's meaning like people actually showing up for things and engaged in ministry. The other two churches that are larger are both prosperity gospel churches. So of course that is another struggle that they are trying to work against. So when we look at our timeline as far as joining the ministry there, our goal is to be fully funded and ready to go by this summer, into the fall. We really love to be there by the end of the year as we look forward. So as God allows and leads, we have committed to serving and giving our lives in Iceland. If that means we're there for the rest of our lives, then we are going open-ended, right? We don't have any time frame. We just want to go and be faithful for as long as God allows us to be there. And we are prayerfully and trying to prepare ourselves for that. Our initial focus as we move forward will be learning the language. So their language is called Icelandic. If you look on the table, there's a Bible there that's written in Icelandic. That language is going to take a very long time for us to learn. Of course, adjusting into the different culture shock and all of that good stuff. And then really digging into our church, committing ourselves and working through ministry and discipleship as much as we possibly can. And really seeking to strengthen the church that's there, as well as help them as they seek to plant other churches around the nation. A couple prayer needs for us and for the church there in Iceland. So of course, faithfulness, this tiny little church, tiny little community of believers that are seeking to be faithful in the midst of a very difficult culture, difficult climate. They're, of course, longing for widespread repentance throughout the nation of Iceland, and of course, they're also praying for repentance in the state church. I mean, wouldn't that be a work of God if God could, and God, of course, He can, revive this church that has completely abandoned the gospel? But that would be a glorious thing to see. They're seeking restoration, and so by this I mean there have been people very recently that have come as missionaries and have done a lot of damage, have brought different philosophies of ministry and different methods that have unfortunately burned a lot of bridges. And because those people were from the States, that makes it even harder for us as a family coming also from America to engage with the community there. So, they're prayerfully thinking through restoration and seeking to rebuild what has been broken, unfortunately. They, of course, also are praying for more laborers, more faithful laborers that would come commit themselves to the work there in Iceland. And then finally, this church and this community would long to see their own people sent out to the nations as their own missions sending force. So those are 5 big prayer requests for the church and the believers there in Iceland. And then, of course, for us, patience, right? Our hearts are torn because we love our community and our church and our family is all here. But then at the same time, we are longing to get there and begin the work of ministry. So just patience through this period and through this season as we continue to allow God to lead us in whatever that looks like. Protection from discouragement and doubt as we've come across many hurdles and many difficulties. A lot of doubt at times as far as, is this wise? Should we be doing this? For me specifically as a dad and as a husband, should I be uprooting my family at such a young age and taking them to a very foreign nation? So just that God would protect us from all of that discouragement and doubt. Of course, grace, we're raising 3 young kids. Number 4 is on the way. So, we are just praying that God would strengthen my marriage with my wife, as well as parenting our children in this season. And of course, we also want to be faithful within our context as long as God keeps us here in the States. So at our church, with our families, we'd long to be faithful and not be so focused on getting to Iceland that we would miss the ministry opportunities that we have while we are still here. And then lastly, support. Of course, we cannot get there unless we are backed by supporters and people that would join our group and our ministry as we get funding to get to Iceland. So all in all, this verse, John 1:5, has become our family's life verse. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. This really is, as we look at Iceland, a nation that is physically dark a lot of the year, but spiritually dark constantly, right? We know that there is one hope and one answer to that, and that is that the light of Christ would shine. And the confidence, of course, we know that the darkness cannot and will never overcome what God is doing there. So that's truly our hope as we look forward to partnering with the church there in Iceland and giving our lives as much as we can to the ministry. So that is it that I have. If anyone has any questions, I of course would love to answer them. And thank you for your time. Yes?
I don't want to forget my question.
Yeah.
The church that has people from every continent
Yeah.
is amazing. So what, is that all in Icelandic?
Yeah, good question. So the people groups that have somehow wound up in Iceland. So they have 4 specific refugee groups that have all ended up in Iceland. They have a couple families from Ukraine, understandably. There's a large group from Venezuela, there's a large group from Ghana, and there's a large group from Iran. So they're dealing with people who speak, very different languages. Venezuela, you have Spanish, you have Russian, you have Iran, probably Arabic or something similar, maybe Farsi. Something in that Middle Eastern. So they're dealing with all of this. And so the church started, Love Stefan started as an Icelandic speaking church. But they've had so many people from the outside come that they've had to now adjust to being an English speaking church, because that is within Europe as a whole, that is the common language. Even people from Venezuela, though they speak very broken English, that's a far cry from Icelandic. So, as you can see, they are by necessity an English-speaking church. But they are hoping to, in the future, have Icelandic churches and Icelandic-speaking services as well. Yeah?
You plan on being fully funded, or will you be bivocational?
Yeah. So we, out of necessity, have to be fully funded. I cannot legally work in Iceland. The reason for that is because Iceland gives preference and priority to, of course, their own citizens as far as a career goes. They give secondary preference and priority to anyone coming from the Nordic nations. They give third priority and preference to anyone coming from Europe. And then on the bottom rung is everyone else, which would be me. And so in order to work for an Icelandic company, you have to demonstrate that you have higher education and specific skills and training that no other Icelander can fill. So I could probably flip burgers or something, but that would be very, very difficult for me to work there as far as outside of the church goes.
And if you plan on being there until you die, will
Yeah.
you retain your U.S. citizenship? Or will you...
Yeah, so if we're there that long, which would be a blessing, we can have dual citizenship, which would be the goal, is to have both of those.
And now we give you the opportunity to then work.
Yes,
there?
yes, correct. If we gained that, then that would be the goal. But so as we've had conversations, when I say work, the long-term goal is, if God would lead, that I would be on staff at the church. They don't really have many people signing up to be pastors of the church at all, so that is, of course, something that very likely would be.
Yeah, are the pastors that are there full-time ministry, or are they bivocational?
Yes, so both of the pastors that are there are also support-raised.
Okay.
The founding, as I mentioned, Gunnar, he's Icelandic. The other pastor is American, but married to an Icelander.
Okay.
So they're both through their own missions agencies as well. The church is so small that it can't even afford to pay one pastor, full-time or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think, I'm back to the language thing in
Yeah.
the church, do you think that having them by necessity having to convert to English as a generic sort of
Yeah.
multinational language, does that probably, I would think that kind of drives away the native Icelanders
It does.
then, because then it's foreign thing to
Yeah.
them.
So most Icelanders can speak English, again, out of necessity. So of course, we've been asked several times, like, why bother learning the language at all? But of course, that's their heart language, right? They can speak in English, but they really don't want to, especially within their own communities. So yeah, that is something that is a hurdle to Icelanders coming in if they have to speak in English. But that's such a minute hurdle, compared to the entire worldview, understanding that, so they have tried Icelandic services, but it's really just become the Icelanders that are already there, just congregating with themselves and speaking Icelandic, and are like, we're not bringing anyone in by doing this. It's just basically a subset of the church that's segregating itself. So they decided there wasn't any purpose in doing that. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Bill, you may have mentioned this at the
Sure.
very beginning, and I may have just missed it, but what is your education background like? So I know that you were in ministry before deciding to go. What, I guess, like, where did you study, or how did you get into wanting to do ministry,
Sure.
just in general?
Good question. So my first interest in ministry was when I was in high school. It really was driven by my youth pastor at the time. He had huge impact on me, and my senior year of high school, at 46 years old, he was diagnosed with ALS. So of course, one of the worst diagnoses I think you can possibly receive, and a disease that normally takes 4 or 5 years. It took his life in 13 months at 46 years old. So as a 17-year-old, watching my pastor, who I love and care for, and who has cared for me, in the midst of such a difficult situation, just a horrible situation, leaving behind a wife and two kids, seeing his steadfastness to the sovereignty of God and trusting that God works through even this most difficult situation. That really was what God used to, I just longed to be that, and to make that the purpose of my life too, is the glory of God in the most difficult situations. So I went on to Bible college from there, as our elders confirmed that I should continue to pursue this path. My two majors, my first was in biblical studies, and then I needed to have a second major that was required at my university. And in God's sovereignty, the only thing that fit into my schedule was a bachelor's of intercultural studies. At this point in time, didn't have a clue we'd be ending up, overseas, but very thankful for that. And then I did my master's at Reformed Baptist Seminary, and that was in pastoral ministry. So God used all those steps to where we are today. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, you did.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
All right, yeah, sure. Yes. Yeah.
Do you speak other languages now? So Icelandic would be your first
Yes,
other language?
it would. So that, again, I keep going back to this, God's providence. The only way, so 3 ways you can move to Iceland legally, outside of being, as an American. The first way is to marry an Icelander. Obviously, that's not an option for us. I'm not sure that would be a good route. The second way is on a work visa, which, as I've explained, is not an opportunity for me right now. The third way is to go on a student visa, which means to study at the University of Iceland. Of course, I'm like, what on earth? Why would I just do that? Other than to get there. But the University of Iceland has an Icelandic as a second language degree program, which is free to people that are willing to come and even try to learn it, because it's so difficult, and it's all taught in English. So again, God provided for that. So that will be my initial task there. Is, little did I know in my 30s I'd be going back to college, but here we are with 4 young children. But yes, that will be how I endeavor to learn this language. Yeah. Anything else? Any other
temperature there all the time.
Yeah, so in the winters, it gets down, like, it's a lot more temperate than people would think. So in the winter, like a cold day is like 15 degrees. And then in the summer, you're thinking high of like 60. So it's within that pretty much all year. The difference being 156 different kinds of wind, which vastly changes, you know, day in and day out what it's like. So they have a wonderful expression in Iceland. They say there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing. So they're all about the layers, all about, yeah, all of that. If you feel that sweater that's back there, you can understand why they wear those all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other